In a world where courage is often measured by how loudly someone speaks, sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who choose silence. This is the story of a woman who stood among hundreds at a military training ground, her hand steady on her rifle while her heart carried secrets that could change everything. When a single whispered word from a decorated colonel cut through the morning air, it didn't just freeze the crowd, it shattered years of carefully built walls and revealed a truth that would transform not just one life, but an entire military base's understanding of what it means to serve with honor. What happened that day at the firing line wasn't just about marksmanship or military protocol. It was about recognition, redemption, and the extraordinary power of someone who had spent years proving herself in silence, only to have her past and present collide in the most unexpected way possible. Sarah Martinez had perfected the art of being invisible. At 28, she moved through the military base like a shadow, completing her duties with precision while keeping conversations to the bare minimum required by protocol. Other soldiers had learned not to push for friendship. She ate alone, trained alone, and spent her off-duty hours reading in her quarters rather than joining the boisterous gatherings at the enlisted club. The morning of the annual marksmanship competition arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made every sound carry further than usual. Sarah adjusted her gear with practiced efficiency, checking her rifle for the 100th time. She had volunteered for the competition, not out of any desire for recognition, but because she genuinely enjoyed the challenge and the solitude it provided. While others saw competition, she saw meditation. The firing range stretched before them like a carefully orchestrated battlefield. Targets dotted the landscape at various distances, each one representing a different level of difficulty. Sarah took her assigned position near the center of the line, flanked by soldiers who chatted nervously about their chances. She remained silent, focusing on the weight of her weapon and the rhythm of her breathing. Sergeant Davis, the range instructor, began calling out instructions through his megaphone. His voice bounced off the surrounding hills, creating an echo that seemed to emphasize the importance of the moment. Sarah barely listened to the familiar commands. She had been shooting since she was 12 years old, taught by her grandfather on the family ranch in Texas. What these soldiers were learning as military protocol, she had absorbed as naturally as breathing. As the first round of shooting began, Sarah's world narrowed to the small circle of her scope. The chatter around her faded to white noise. Her finger found the trigger with the same familiarity as a pianist finding middle C. The first shot rang out clean and true, hitting dead center on the 200-yard target. She worked methodically through each distance, her shots forming tight groupings that would make any instructor proud. But Sarah wasn't shooting for praise. She was shooting because in those moments of absolute focus, the weight of her secrets felt lighter. The memories that usually pressed against her consciousness like storm clouds seemed to dissipate in the concentration required for perfect marksmanship. Each successful shot was a small victory against the darkness she carried. Colonel James Morrison had been watching from the observation tower, initially out of casual interest, but increasingly with focused attention. At 52, he had seen thousands of soldiers come through training, but something about the quiet woman at position 12 caught his eye. Her form was textbook perfect, but more than that, she moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of experience beyond her apparent age. Through his binoculars, the colonel watched Sarah transition between targets with fluid precision. She never rushed, never second-guessed herself, and never celebrated her obvious successes. There was something almost mechanical about her performance, yet it was infused with a grace that suggested deep emotional connection to the act of shooting. This wasn't just skill. This was artistry born of necessity. As the competition progressed through its various stages, other soldiers began to take notice of Sarah's performance. Whispers started circulating about the quiet woman who was quietly dominating the competition. Some watched her with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with the kind of resentment that comes from being overshadowed by someone they had previously ignored. Private Johnson, a cocky 22-year-old from Chicago, had been the odds-on favorite to win the competition. He had arrived at the base 6 months earlier with tales of his shooting prowess and a swagger that suggested he considered military marksmanship training beneath his abilities. As Sarah's scores were announced after each stage, his confidence began to crack like ice under pressure. "Who is she?" Johnson muttered to his buddy, Corporal Williams, as they watched Sarah prepare for the long-distance portion of the competition. "I've never seen her at the range before." Williams shrugged. "Martinez, I think. She keeps to herself, does her job, doesn't cause trouble, doesn't really talk to anyone. I heard she requested night shifts in the communications room just to avoid interaction with people." The long-distance targets were set at 600 yards, a distance that separated skilled shooters from truly exceptional ones. The wind had picked up slightly, adding an element of complexity that would challenge even experienced marksmen. Sarah studied the flags placed at intervals along the range, calculating wind speed and direction with the methodical approach of someone who had learned to read nature's subtle cues. Colonel Morrison continued his observation, but now he was joined by other officers who had heard about the unexpected standout performer. Major Patricia Hayes, the base's executive officer, raised her own binoculars to watch Sarah's approach to the challenging shots. "She's incredibly composed," Major Hayes observed. "Look at her breathing pattern, her stance. That's not standard military training, that's something learned over years." The colonel nodded, his mind beginning to work through possibilities. There was something familiar about Sarah's shooting style, something that tugged at memories he couldn't quite place. He had served in various capacities for over 30 years, had worked with special operations units, had trained alongside some of the military's most elite marksmen. Sarah's technique reminded him of something specific, something important, but the memory remained frustratingly out of reach. As Sarah prepared for her first 600-yard shot, the entire firing line had grown quiet. Even the instructors had stopped their casual conversations to watch. The pressure of attention that would have rattled most shooters seemed to have no effect on her. She settled into position as if she were alone on her grandfather's ranch, targeting prairie dogs that threatened the cattle feed. The shot rang out with authority, the sound rolling across the range like thunder. Through the spotting scopes, observers could see the hit markers indicating another perfect center shot. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd of spectators. Sarah cycled the bolt of her rifle smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge, and chambering the next round without lifting her eye from the scope. Shot after shot, her performance remained flawless. The wind shifted several times during the long-distance phase, but Sarah adjusted instinctively, her corrections so subtle they were almost imperceptible. She was shooting as if the rifle were an extension of her body, as if the targets were magnetic and the bullets were drawn to their centers by invisible force. Private Johnson's frustration reached a boiling point as he struggled with the wind conditions. His shots scattered around the target in a pattern that spoke of overthinking and anxiety. He glanced repeatedly at Sarah, his resentment growing with each of her perfect shots. The competition that had seemed like a guaranteed victory for him was slipping away to a woman he had never considered a threat. Colonel Morrison felt the memory crystallizing in his mind, like a photograph developing in solution. The shooting style, the absolute composure under pressure, the way Sarah held her rifle like it was a natural extension of her body. It all reminded him of someone he had known years earlier, someone whose skills had been legendary in a very different context. During a brief break between shooting phases, the colonel made his way down from the observation tower. He walked slowly along the firing line, ostensibly checking on the competitors, but actually positioning himself for a better look at Sarah. She was sitting quietly on the ground behind her shooting position, cleaning her rifle with the same methodical precision she applied to her marksmanship. As he approached, Sarah sensed his presence and looked up briefly. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Colonel Morrison felt a jolt of recognition that hit him like an electric shock. Those eyes, that composed expression under pressure, the way she immediately returned her attention to her weapon rather than acknowledging his rank with the deference most soldiers showed. It all clicked into place with startling clarity. But he said nothing, not yet. Instead, he continued his walk along the line, his mind racing with implications and possibilities. If he was right about who Sarah Martinez really was, then her presence at this base represented far more than a simple case of a talented soldier keeping a low profile. It meant that one of the most remarkable stories of courage and sacrifice he had ever witnessed was still being written, and that the quiet woman who had been invisible to everyone around her was actually someone whose reputation had once echoed through the highest levels of military command. The afternoon phase of the competition would test the shooter's abilities under simulated combat conditions. Targets would appear at random intervals and distances, requiring quick target acquisition and accurate shooting under time pressure. It was the kind of challenge that separated recreational shooters from those who had learned their skills in life or death situations. Sarah approached this phase with the same calm demeanor she had shown all day. But Colonel Morrison could now see what others missed. The subtle signs of someone who had learned to shoot not on peaceful ranges, but in places where missing meant dying. The way she scanned the range before the exercise began, identifying cover positions and escape routes out of pure habit. The way her hand rested on her rifle, not with the careful respect of someone handling a tool, but with the casual intimacy of someone handling a lifeline. As the afternoon wore on and Sarah's dominance of the competition became undeniable, more people began to take notice. Word spread beyond the range to other areas of the base. Off-duty soldiers drifted over to watch the quiet woman who was rewriting the base record books with every shot. Even the base commander, General Patricia Wells, made an appearance, curious about the soldier who had apparently been hiding extraordinary capabilities in plain sight. The final phase of the competition would be the most challenging, moving targets at varying distances under simulated combat stress. Speakers would blast sounds of gunfire and explosions while targets popped up randomly across the range. Shooters would have to engage multiple targets quickly while maintaining accuracy. It was designed to test not just marksmanship skills, but mental toughness and the ability to perform under the kind of stress that soldiers might face in actual combat. Sarah loaded her final magazine with the same careful attention to detail she had shown all day. Around her, other competitors were psyching themselves up, some talking loudly to mask their nervousness, others falling into focused silence. She remained in her own bubble of calm preparation, but Colonel Morrison could see the subtle shift in her posture that indicated she was drawing on deeper reserves of experience and determination. The exercise began with a cacophony of simulated battle sounds. Targets began appearing across the range in rapid succession, some staying visible for only seconds before dropping back down. The other competitors began firing rapidly, their shots echoing across the range in an uneven rhythm that spoke of adrenaline and haste. Sarah fired with the same measured precision she had shown all day, but now with increased speed that didn't sacrifice accuracy. Her shots came in controlled pairs, each one finding its mark before she transitioned to the next target. She moved through the exercise like someone who had done this dance before, not in training but in reality. Colonel Morrison watched through his binoculars, his suspicions now certainty. The way Sarah moved, the way she prioritized targets, the absolute lack of wasted motion or panic in her responses, this wasn't just exceptional military training. This was combat-tested skill, honed in situations where there were no do-overs and no second chances. As the final targets dropped and the exercise concluded, an unusual quiet settled over the range. Even before the official scores were announced, everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Sarah had not just won the competition, she had dominated it in a way that redefined what the others had thought was possible. But as she began to pack her equipment with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all day, preparing to slip away from the attention as she always did, Colonel Morrison knew that her story was far from over. In fact, he suspected that the most important chapter was about to begin, triggered by a single word that would change everything for the woman who had kept her secrets hidden behind perfect marksmanship and careful anonymity. The awards ceremony was scheduled for the following Friday, a week that passed like slow torture for Sarah Martinez. She had tried to decline the recognition, citing personal reasons, but military protocol demanded her attendance. The base commander had personally insisted, leaving Sarah with no avenue for escape from the spotlight she had spent years avoiding. During that week, whispers followed her everywhere. Soldiers who had never spoken to her before suddenly found reasons to engage her in conversation. Her shooting scores had spread throughout the base like wildfire, with each retelling adding embellishment until some versions had her performing impossible feats of marksmanship. Sarah responded to all inquiries with polite monosyllables, maintaining the same professional distance she had cultivated since her arrival at the base 18 months earlier. Colonel Morrison spent the week conducting quiet research. Military personnel records, transfer documents, commendations, and disciplinary actions. He reviewed everything available about Sarah Martinez. The official record painted the picture of a competent but unremarkable soldier, enlisted at 26, slightly older than typical recruits, previous employment listed as ranch work in Texas. No significant achievements beyond consistent good performance reviews, no disciplinary issues, no standout moments, nothing to suggest the extraordinary capabilities he had witnessed. But Colonel Morrison had learned long ago that the most important stories in military service were often the ones that never made it into official records. He began making discreet phone calls to contacts throughout the service, asking carefully worded questions about exceptional female snipers who might have served in unconventional capacities. The responses he received were intriguing. Several people mentioned rumors of a female operative who had worked with special operations units in Afghanistan, someone whose skills were legendary but whose identity remained classified even years later. Meanwhile, Sarah struggled with sleepless nights filled with memories she had spent 2 years trying to suppress. The attention from the shooting competition had cracked the carefully constructed shell she had built around her past. Images flashed through her dreams. Desert landscapes, the weight of a different rifle, faces of teammates who hadn't made it home. The moment everything changed and she had been forced to disappear into a new identity for her own protection. The morning of the awards ceremony arrived, gray and cold, matching Sarah's mood as she dressed in her formal uniform. She had considered every possible excuse to avoid the event, even contemplating reporting to sick call with fabricated symptoms. But military discipline ran deep in her bones, deeper even than her desire for anonymity. She would attend, accept whatever recognition was being offered, and then return to her quiet existence as quickly as possible. The base auditorium filled slowly with soldiers, officers, and civilian staff. Sarah arrived precisely at the designated time, taking a seat in the back row where she hoped to remain inconspicuous. Her plan was to accept her award quickly and leave before the inevitable social gathering that followed such events. Colonel Morrison entered the auditorium 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. He scanned the crowd methodically, his eyes finding Sarah in her chosen corner. She sat with military posture, hands folded in her lap, eyes focused straight ahead. To most observers, she appeared calm and composed, but the colonel could see the subtle signs of tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed just slightly against each other, the controlled breathing of someone fighting to maintain composure. General Wells took the podium, beginning with the standard remarks about military excellence and the importance of marksmanship skills. Sarah barely listened to the opening speech, focusing instead on her breathing exercises and visualization techniques she had learned years earlier for managing stress in life-threatening situations. She found it ironic that she needed those same techniques to survive a simple award ceremony. Several awards were presented for various categories of achievement. Sarah watched politely as soldiers she barely knew walked across the stage to receive recognition for their service. She calculated timing in her head, estimating when her category would be called and planning the most efficient route to and from the stage. The award for overall marksmanship excellence, General Wells announced, goes to a soldier whose performance last week was truly extraordinary. Her scores broke multiple base records and demonstrated the kind of skill we hope to see from all our service members. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized her moment was approaching. She mentally rehearsed her movements: stand when called, walk to the stage using the shortest route, accept the award with minimal interaction, return to her seat, wait an appropriate interval, then leave quietly. Specialist Sarah Martinez, please come forward.
The applause that erupted was more enthusiastic than Sarah had expected.
As she stood and began walking toward the stage, she could feel hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. The walk seemed to take forever, each step echoing in the large auditorium despite the carpeted floor. She maintained her professional composure, but inside, she felt exposed in a way that reminded her of moving through hostile territory without adequate cover. General Wells smiled warmly as Sarah approached the podium. Specialist Martinez, your performance at last week's marksmanship competition was truly remarkable. Your scores were not just the highest we've recorded at this base, but among the highest in the entire division's history. Sarah accepted the plaque with a brief nod and quiet, "Thank you, ma'am." She turned to face the audience for the traditional photograph, planning to return to her seat immediately afterward. But as she stood there, the applause continuing longer than expected, she noticed Colonel Morrison rising from his seat in the front row. He walked slowly toward the stage, his expression thoughtful and serious. The applause gradually died down as people sensed that something unscripted was about to happen. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, recognizing the colonel as the officer who had been observing her so intently during the competition. Colonel Morrison climbed the steps to the stage, approaching Sarah with deliberate steps. General Wells looked puzzled but stepped aside to give him room. The auditorium fell completely silent, everyone sensing that they were about to witness something significant. The colonel stopped directly in front of Sarah, studying her face with intense focus. Sarah maintained eye contact despite every instinct telling her to look away. For a long moment they stood facing each other in complete silence, the tension in the room palpable. Then Colonel Morrison leaned forward slightly and spoke a single word, his voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to carry in the silent auditorium. "Phoenix." The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Sarah's carefully maintained composure cracked like a dam under pressure. Her eyes widened in shock. Her breathing became shallow, and for a moment she looked as if she might collapse. The plaque in her hands trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the earthquake happening inside her mind. The word hit her like a physical blow, dragging her instantly back to memories she had buried so deep they felt like someone else's life. Phoenix had been her call sign, her identity in a world where real names were dangerous luxuries. Phoenix, the operative who could appear from nowhere, eliminate targets with impossible precision, and disappear again like smoke in the wind. Phoenix, who had saved countless lives and completed missions that officially never existed. Phoenix, who had been burned when an operation went wrong, and her identity was compromised by someone she trusted. Phoenix, who had been declared dead to protect her from the enemies she had made in the shadows of America's secret wars. Phoenix, who had ceased to exist so that Sarah Martinez could live quietly on a military base, shooting targets for recreation instead of shooting people for her country. The auditorium remained frozen in tableau, hundreds of people witnessing a moment of recognition that none of them understood. Colonel Morrison continued to study Sarah's face, reading confirmation in her shock. He had been right about her identity, but seeing her reaction made him realize just how deeply she had buried her past and how much pain his single word had caused. General Wells stepped forward, sensing that whatever was happening between her marksmanship champion and one of her colonels required immediate management. "Colonel Morrison," she said quietly, "perhaps we should continue this conversation in private." But Sarah had recovered enough of her composure to speak. Her voice was steady despite the turmoil in her eyes. "That name means nothing to me, sir. I believe you have me confused with someone else." Colonel Morrison nodded slowly, understanding the denial even as he knew the truth. "Perhaps," he said diplomatically. "I apologize if I was mistaken. But the damage was done." Even as the ceremony concluded and people began filing out of the auditorium, Sarah could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. Her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered by a single word, and she knew there was no going back to the invisible existence she had built. Later that evening, alone in her quarters, Sarah sat on her narrow bed and stared at the marksmanship award she had tried so hard not to win. The metal plaque reflected the light from her desk lamp, creating patterns on the wall that reminded her of muzzle flashes in the darkness of foreign countries. She had spent 2 years running from Phoenix, convincing herself that person no longer existed, that the skills and memories and scars belonged to someone else. But Colonel Morrison's single word had brought it all flooding back. The missions in Afghanistan and Iraq, working with special operations teams to eliminate high-value targets. The perfect record of successful operations, each one saving American lives by removing threats that conventional forces couldn't reach. The camaraderie with operators who understood that some missions required people willing to operate outside normal rules of engagement. And then the betrayal that had ended it all. Someone she trusted, someone who knew her real name and background, had sold information to enemy forces. The last mission, the one that was supposed to be routine, had become a trap. Sarah had barely escaped with her life, but her identity as Phoenix was blown. The military had faked her death, given her a new identity, and arranged for her quiet discharge into civilian life. For 6 months she had tried to build a normal life in Texas, working on a ranch, trying to forget the weight of a sniper rifle and the satisfaction of a perfect shot. But civilian life felt empty and purposeless. She had enlisted under her new identity, seeking the structure and meaning that military service provided, but determined to remain anonymous and avoid any situation that might reveal her past. The shooting competition had been a moment of weakness, a brief return to the excellence that had once defined her. She had told herself she was just having fun, enjoying the challenge, proving nothing to anyone. But deep down, she knew she had been showing off, demonstrating skills she should have kept hidden, risking exposure for the simple pleasure of being exceptional at something again. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Sarah quickly hid the award in her wall locker and checked her appearance in the small mirror above her sink before opening the door. Colonel Morrison stood in the hallway, his expression serious but not unkind. "May I come in, Specialist Martinez?" he asked formally. Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, though every instinct screamed at her to refuse. She remained standing at attention despite the informal setting, waiting for him to speak first. Colonel Morrison looked around the spartanly furnished quarters, noting the absence of personal items that typically decorated soldiers' rooms. No photographs, no decorations, no evidence of interests or relationships outside of military service. It was the room of someone determined to remain anonymous, to avoid creating any traces that might lead back to who they really were. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "about Phoenix, about why you're really here, and about what happens next." Sarah maintained her rigid posture, but her voice carried the weight of 2 years of careful deception. "I told you, sir, I don't know what that name means. I think there's been some kind of mistake." Colonel Morrison sighed and sat down in the single chair at Sarah's small desk. "Specialist, I was the operations liaison for Task Force Wraith from 2021 to 2023. I coordinated intelligence and target packages for your team. I personally reviewed mission reports for every Operation Phoenix completed during that time period." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Task Force Wraith was classified at levels so high that its existence was denied by everyone from the Secretary of Defense down. For Colonel Morrison to know that name, to know her connection to it, meant that he had clearance levels that placed him in a very small circle of people who knew the truth about America's most secret operations. I know about Kabul, he continued softly. I know about the 18 confirmed kills that prevented the embassy bombing. I know about Mosul and the 3-day siege where you held off an entire insurgent company until reinforcements arrived. I know about the operation in Syria that officially never happened but saved the lives of an entire special operations team.
Sarah felt her legs weaken.
These weren't details that appeared in any public records. These were classified mission summaries that only a handful of people would have access to. Colonel Morrison wasn't guessing about her identity. He knew exactly who she was. And I know about Kandahar, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I know about the intelligence leak that compromised your position. I know about the firefight that lasted 6 hours and left 3 of your teammates dead. I know that Phoenix died officially that day so that you could live. Sarah finally broke, sinking onto her bed as the weight of memories she had fought so hard to suppress came crashing down. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to remember, not just the skills and the missions, but the people. Martinez, Rodriguez, and Chang, her spotter team, who had died because someone she trusted had sold them out. Good soldiers, better friends, who deserved to be remembered instead of buried in classified files and forgotten. Why? She asked, her voice barely audible. Why bring this up now? I've been doing my job, staying out of trouble, not causing problems for anyone. Why couldn't you just let me disappear? Colonel Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression compassionate but determined. Because Phoenix was too good to waste, and because the war isn't over. We need you back, Sarah. The country needs you back. The secure briefing room in the basement of the base headquarters building felt like a tomb. Sarah sat across from Colonel Morrison and 2 other officers she didn't recognize, all of them wearing expressions that suggested the conversation they were about to have would change her life forever. Again, Major General Catherine Hayes, a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, spread a collection of photographs across the metal table. Each image showed a face Sarah didn't recognize, but the way they were arranged suggested these were target profiles. 3 months ago, General Hayes began without preamble. We lost contact with a deep cover operative in Syria. Agent callsign Falcon had been providing intelligence on a terrorist network that was planning coordinated attacks on American military installations across the Middle East. Sarah studied the photographs without touching them, her trained eye automatically cataloging details and memorizing faces. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had once meant the difference between life and death for American soldiers. Falcon's last transmission indicated that the terrorist cell had acquired detailed intelligence about our base security protocols, Colonel Morrison continued. Intelligence that could only have come from someone with high-level security clearance within our own forces. The implications hit Sarah immediately. Another intelligence leak, another situation where American lives were at risk because someone in a position of trust had chosen money or ideology over their oath of service. The same scenario that had destroyed her old life was playing out again, and they wanted Phoenix to clean up the mess. 2 weeks ago, we intercepted communications suggesting that coordinated attacks are planned for bases in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The timeline is compressed. We believe the attacks will happen within the next 30 days. General Hayes tapped one of the photographs showing a bearded man with cold eyes. This is Hassan al-Rashid, the cell leader. He's personally responsible for the deaths of over 200 American service members over the past 5 years. Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady, despite the turmoil in her mind. What does this have to do with me? I'm just a communications specialist at a training base in Colorado. The third officer, who had been introduced as Colonel Williams from Special Operations Command, leaned forward with a slight smile. Specialist Martinez, your official military record might say communications specialist, but your skill set says something entirely different. We need Phoenix for this mission. Phoenix is dead, Sarah replied firmly. She died in Kandahar 2 years ago, along with 3 good soldiers who trusted the wrong people. General Hayes nodded sympathetically. I understand your reluctance, Sarah. I really do. The betrayal you experienced would shake anyone's faith in the system. But sometimes the system fails, and when it does, we need people who can operate outside normal channels to make things right. Colonel Morrison activated a laptop and turned the screen towards Sarah. Satellite imagery filled the display, showing a compound in what appeared to be rugged mountain terrain. Al-Rashid's location has been confirmed through multiple intelligence sources. The problem is that he's being protected by sympathizers within the local government. Any official military action would create a diplomatic incident and likely result in his escape. Sarah recognized the type of mission immediately. A scenario where official channels were blocked by politics, where plausible deniability was essential, where someone needed to go in quietly and solve the problem without leaving fingerprints. The kind of mission that Phoenix had specialized in, the kind that kept American soldiers safe by eliminating threats before they could act. The compound is in a remote valley approximately 40 kilometers southeast of Aleppo, Colonel Williams explained, using a laser pointer to highlight features on the satellite image. Intelligence suggests al-Rashid rarely travels, preferring to conduct operations from this secure location. Our window of opportunity is narrow. Sarah studied the imagery with professional interest despite her reluctance. The compound was well positioned defensively with clear fields of fire in multiple directions and only a few approaches that wouldn't expose an infiltrating force to observation. But there were weaknesses too. Blind spots created by the terrain. Structures that could provide concealment for someone with the right skills. What about extraction? She asked, then immediately regretted the question. By asking about mission details, she was unconsciously sliding back into the operational mindset that had once defined her life. General Hayes smiled. We've identified 3 potential extraction routes, each with different risk profiles depending on how the mission develops. You would have full communication support and backup assets positioned to assist if needed.
I haven't said yes, Sarah pointed out quickly. I'm asking theoretical questions about a theoretical mission. Colonel Morrison opened another file folder, this one containing what appeared to be personnel records.
Sarah, I want you to look at something. These are files for soldiers currently deployed to bases that al-Rashid's network is targeting.
He spread out dozens of photographs, each one showing a young face in military uniform, men and women in their 20s and 30s, people with families and futures, people who had volunteered to serve their country and deserved to come home alive.
Private Amanda Chen, 22 years old, deployed to Kuwait for her first overseas assignment. She has a 2-year-old daughter waiting at home.
Colonel Morrison tapped one photograph.
Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, 28, married last month, and planning to start a family when he returns from Iraq. The names and faces blurred together as Sarah looked at photograph after photograph. Each one represented a life that could be saved if al-Rashid's network was disrupted. A family that wouldn't have to receive a folded flag and condolences from a grateful nation. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, an Army medic who saved dozens of lives during her deployment to Afghanistan. General Hayes continued the recitation. Captain David Park, an intelligence officer whose work has prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks over the past year. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the emotional manipulation she recognized, but couldn't resist. These weren't just photographs. They were faces of people like the teammates she had lost in Kandahar. Good soldiers doing difficult jobs in dangerous places, depending on people like Phoenix to eliminate threats before those threats could eliminate them. How long do I have to decide? She asked quietly. The mission launches in 72 hours. Colonel Williams replied. We need your answer by tomorrow morning. Sarah stood up from the table, her decision-making process complicated by emotions she had spent 2 years trying to suppress. I need time to think. General Hayes nodded understandingly. Of course. But Sarah, I want you to understand something. The intelligence leak that compromised your position in Kandahar, we found the source. Master Sergeant Thomas Bradley was court-martialed 6 months ago and sentenced to life in prison. The person who betrayed you and your team has been held accountable. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 2 years she had lived with the knowledge that someone had sold out her team, but she had never learned who. The uncertainty had been almost worse than the betrayal itself, making her question every interaction and trust no one completely. Bradley was feeding information to multiple terrorist networks for over 3 years, Colonel Morrison added. His betrayal resulted in the deaths of dozens of American service members. But his arrest has given us access to his communication networks and intelligence about ongoing terrorist operations. Sarah walked to the small window that looked out onto the base's parade ground. Young soldiers were conducting evening formation, their voices carrying faintly through the reinforced glass. They looked impossibly young to her now, reminders of the person she had been before Phoenix, before the weight of classified missions and necessary secrets. If I do this, she said without turning around, it's not because I'm Phoenix. Phoenix died in Kandahar with Martinez, Rodriguez, and Chang. If I do this, it's as Sarah Martinez, because these soldiers deserve the same protection my team should have had. Over the next 24 hours, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on routine duties. Her mind kept returning to the mission briefing, analyzing approaches and contingencies with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such planning. She tried to focus on communications equipment maintenance and training schedules, but her thoughts kept drifting to wind patterns around Aleppo and the ballistic characteristics of various rifle calibers at extended range. That evening she made a secure phone call to a number she hadn't dialed in over 2 years. The voice that answered was familiar and warm, belonging to Maria Santos, the widow of one of her fallen teammates. "Sarah? My God, it's really you. Carlos would be so happy to know you're okay." Maria's voice carried the accent of her native Puerto Rico, softened by years of military life. "I heard rumors that you were alive somewhere, but nobody would tell me anything official." Sarah struggled with how much she could reveal over an unsecured line. "I'm doing well, Maria. How are the kids?" "Growing too fast. Carlos Jr. just turned 8, and Isabella is starting kindergarten next month. They ask about their papa's army friends sometimes. I tell them stories about the good times, the barbecues, and the holidays when you all were stationed together." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering safe topics and shared memories from before everything went wrong. But as they prepared to end the call, Maria's voice became serious. "Sarah, I don't know what you're doing now or where you are, but I want you to know something. Carlos died doing what he believed in, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He wouldn't want his death to stop you from continuing that work if you felt called to do it." The words stayed with Sarah long after the call ended. She sat in her quarters, staring at the marksmanship award she had tried to forget, thinking about the soldiers in those photographs and the families who were counting on people like her to keep their loved ones safe. At 0600 the next morning, Sarah appeared at Colonel Morrison's office in full combat gear, carrying the specialized rifle case she hadn't opened in 2 years. Her decision was made, conveyed not through words but through her presence and preparation. Colonel Morrison looked up from his desk and nodded with satisfaction. "Welcome back, Phoenix." "Not Phoenix. Sarah Martinez, United States Army." "Phoenix was someone else, someone who made mistakes and trusted the wrong people. I won't make those mistakes again." The insertion went flawlessly. Sarah found herself back in the element she had been born for, alone in hostile territory, depending entirely on her skills and judgment to complete a mission that could save dozens of lives. The familiar weight of her rifle felt like coming home, and the clarity of purpose she had been missing for 2 years settled around her like armor. The compound surveillance took 18 hours of patient observation, cataloging guard routines and identifying the precise moment when Al-Rashid would be vulnerable. Sarah's shot, when it came, was perfect. A single round at 847 meters that eliminated the terrorist leader instantly and sent his organization into chaos. The extraction was complicated by unexpected enemy movement, but Sarah's tactical skills proved as sharp as her marksmanship. She reached the pickup point exactly on schedule, carrying intelligence materials that would help prevent the planned attacks and save hundreds of American lives. Back at the base in Colorado, Sarah submitted her after-action report and prepared to return to her quiet life as a communications specialist. But General Hayes had different plans. 3 more terrorist cells had been identified, 3 more situations where official diplomatic channels were blocked, and Phoenix-level skills were needed. Sarah looked at the new mission folders, then at the photographs of deployed soldiers whose lives hung in the balance. The choice was clear, as it had always been clear for people like her. Some battles required soldiers willing to operate in the shadows, to accept risks and burdens that others couldn't bear. "How long?" she asked simply. "As long as it takes," General Hayes replied. "As long as there are American soldiers in harm's way, and people like Al-Rashid planning to hurt them." Sarah nodded, accepting not just the mission but the return to a life she had thought was finished forever. Phoenix might have died in Kandahar, but Sarah Martinez had chosen to pick up that burden and carry it forward, not for glory or recognition, but for the young faces in those photographs and all the other soldiers who depended on people like her to stand between them and the darkness. The woman who had kept to herself at the firing line was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some silences must be broken and some talents could not remain hidden. When lives hung in the balance, Colonel Morrison's whispered word had not just frozen the crowd that day, it had awakened a guardian who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that other soldiers could sleep safely in dangerous places, protected by someone who had learned that the highest form of service sometimes required the deepest sacrifice of anonymity. 6 months later, newspaper headlines would mention terrorist operations that had been mysteriously disrupted, high-value targets who had simply disappeared, and intelligence breaches that had been sealed before they could cost American lives. But they would never mention the quiet woman whose perfect marksmanship and willingness to serve in the shadows had made those victories possible. Sarah Martinez had found her way home, not to a place but to a purpose that honored both the teammates she had lost and the soldiers she was sworn to protect. The crowd at the firing line had been frozen by recognition, but Sarah had been freed by it, released from the prison of anonymity to resume the mission that defined her, standing guard in the darkness so others could live in the light.